Hello everyone, Ethan here, and welcome back to another introduction lecture. Today, as evident from the horribly obfuscated diagram on the board, we're going to be studying the various perspectives of socionics. And I thought I would create this lecture as sort of a corollary to the original lecture, The Origins of Socionics, to sort of describe how those origins bled into what we believe to be the state of modern day socionics. And so as you can see, we go from Aushra Augusta to some of the preliminary schools, down to some of the secondary schools, which made its way eventually to the West, and how we teach socionics today. And so there's a lot to cover, there's a lot to get into, and a lot to explore about how socionics was the way that it was. So let's get started. So the way that this board is constructed is I have all of the schools on the board. I have all the major schools, all of the major Russian socionists, all the major Western socionists on the board, so that you can observe their connections, their interconnections, how they changed one another. And so there are a lot of names that I've left out. Obviously, there are many, many socionists. There are probably thousands of socionists. But the most relevant ones I've included on this board, the most relevant that I believe to spreading the theory and inducing change in other perspectives. So we'll start with Aushra Augusta, as we did in the last lecture. So Aushra Augusta started socionics in the 1970s in a town called Vilnius, Lithuania, where she lived. And initially, when she created the theory, she worked with the School of Socionics in St. Petersburg, Russia. Obviously, the school didn't exist before she did, but once it was created, Aushra worked with the School of St. Petersburg. She specifically worked with a socialist called Grigory Reinin, if you remember from the last video, and they co-authored a paper called The Theory of Reinin Signs. And that's a speculative topic that I'm going to be getting into in a far, far future lecture, but just so you know, they were one of the first people to work together. Some other socialists that come from the St. Petersburg school are Ekaterina Filatova. Her descriptions are pretty popular on the internet. And Vera Stradievskaya, her descriptions are also very popular on the internet. And the St. Petersburg school was created in the 90s, and it resulted in a lot of other perspectives, like the school of dynamic socionics, led by Vladimir Mironov. Now, he's not such a prominent socialist, but I thought I would include his perspective anyway, since a lot of people know of him. And also, Viktor Talanov, a socialist, split off from the St. Petersburg school to create a new perspective called Model T. Perhaps something that I should clarify is that the majority of the socionics on this board is Model A socionics, meaning the structure of Model A is kept consistent across most of the models. And if you see some square boxes, that indicates where people branched off, created their own model, a different structure to the theory that they independently investigated. So yeah, that's basically what the St. Petersburg school led to. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention. The St. Petersburg school also influenced the School of Associative Socionics, led by Olga Tangeman. And that one's not very influential to this day, but it helped influence a very influential Western perspective, which is why I placed it on the board as I did. So another perspective that split off from Aushra Augusta's original perspective was the Research Institute of Socionics in Moscow, Russia, also in the 90s. And that school was led by Tatiana Prokofieva and Lyuba Beskova. And again, those aren't some very popular socialists, but the website itself is pretty popular, and the institute is larger than many other institutes. Another school that split off, probably the most major school that split off from Aushra Augusta, was the International Institute of Socionics in Kiev, Ukraine. This time not in Russia, but in Ukraine, in the Ukraine. And some of the most influential Russian socialists have come from this International Institute, one of them being Alexander Bukulov, the creator of the concept of dimensionality, and also the creator of another perspective called Model B, which isn't studied at all to this day, but I thought I would mention it because it is a notable advance in the theory. He's very well known. He teaches socionics to this day. You can contact him on Facebook. You can message him. You can look at his material, whatever. He's still producing content. So the International Institute is still probably the dominant force in the Eastern Hemisphere, might I say, of socionics content. Another pair of Socionists that came from the International Institute was Meged and Ovcharov. And initially they aligned with the perspective, but over time their ideas kind of diverged from the International Institute and they split off and did their own thing, and now they're not nearly as popular as they were before. Another, probably one of the most influential Socialists period, split that was originally engaged in the International Institute but split off was Viktor Gulenko. Gulenko joined the International Institute in the 90s. He worked on a lot of foundational Model A work, and then he realized that socionics needed to be taken in a different direction from his perspective, and he split off and formed the School of Humanitarian Socionics with its own model to boot, an entirely new model called Model G. And Viktor Gulenko is, again, still very influential. You can look at his videos on YouTube. He has a School of Humanitarian Socionics channel. He has, dozens, not dozens, but many students. But his perspective notably differs from the other Russian socialists. So that is something to keep in mind. And I guess another perspective, I forgot to mention as well. See, this is very complicated. I have a lot of stuff on the board, and please bear with me if this isn't the most organized lecture out there. I just thought it would be good to illustrate all of these different perspectives for the end segment that I plan to talk about at the end of this lecture. Another school, another secondary school, like the School of Humanitarian Socionics, that branched off from the International Institute was the School of System Socionics, led by Vladimir Ermak and one of his students, Irina Eglet. And as I talked about in the last lecture, their school focuses more on the cybernetics of Model A. They're interested in Model A, but they believe that some more cybernetics aspects of system theory should be included in the theory for it to work properly. And so that diverged from the International Institute, from the more orthodox perspective, and created the School of System Socionics to explore their own perspective. And one last socionics perspective from the Eastern Hemisphere is socionico.net. It's a website led by Dmitry Leitov, where he kind of pools together all of the information from these different schools to create articles and source these articles from all these major socionists so that English speakers, Russian speakers don't have to comb the internet to look for all of these various authors and all of these various perspectives on what socionics is. And so that is a pretty decent, comprehensive picture of the Eastern Hemisphere socionics. I added this dotted line here to indicate where socionics crossed over to the West. And that was a question that I asked in the last lecture, was how did socionics transfer from East to West? We have all of these different groups, all of these different schools. Which ones were the ones that influenced the Western perspective, and how did socionics initially transfer to the West? So there are two main access points for where socionics transferred to the West. The first was Sergei Ganin. He studied at the International Institute. He brought his ideas to the West, albeit controversial, and formed Socionics.com, arguably the first English-speaking socionics source in the Western Hemisphere. His perspective, like I said, they're not very mainstream, but he was one of the first to bring socionics to the West, so his perspectives have been very influential and impacting to the West's understanding of socionics, and also explains why some of the West differs quite a bit from the East in terms of knowledge. Sergei Ganin influenced the 16types.com, which was probably the largest forum for English-speaking socionics in the early 2000s. And this website had various authors. Various authors wrote about socionics, wrote their theoretical papers. They wrote what they thought socionics was and how it would be explained. And it was mostly a forum where people discussed some issues in socionics and how to reconcile them. But before I move on, I should discuss the second access point, and that was Rick Delong. And Rick also studied at the International Institute of Socionics under Viktor Gulenko, when Gulenko was a part of the International Institute in the 90s, and he came back and he formed a website called Socionics.us, which was, again, arguably one of the first English-speaking socionics resources that came pretty much straight from the Russian perspective. And he taught socionics in the English-speaking world, and then he kind of made his departure in the late 2000s, but his website still stands as very influential. It's not currently up, but it's still remembered as being influential to the English-speaking community. So some current perspectives that are more influential are Wikisocion. Wikisocion resulted from a lot of collaboration. It's like a Wikipedia for socionics. I'm sure many of you watching this video have been on that website before, and it was sourced from people on the 16 types, people from Socionics.com. Rick Delong contributed some things. Peter Bartle from World Socionics Society contributed some things. Many people contributed things to Wikisocion, so it's kind of like a melting pot of English-speaking socionics resources that people can just peruse, look at, observe, whatever they want to do with the resources. As well as that, there's Whole Socionics, made by Ibrahim Tensor. This perspective is still running. Ibrahim Tensor is still conducting Socionics. His perspective was influenced quite a bit from Socionics.us and Rick Delong's work, as well as some of the Russian sources. And another one of the most popular modern day sources is the World Socionics Society, whose creator, Jack Oliver Aaron, used to work with Olga Tangeman in the School of Associative Socionics, but later branched off and collaborated with Peter Bartle to form a new perspective based on the fundamentals of Model A. And he also, with Peter, contributed to Wikisocion. And there's also some sources that I wasn't able to find any information on, some sources that I know exist and I know that are influential, but I just have no idea where they got their material from, and that is sociotype.com, which is, composed of various authors, and it has a lot of information, a lot of varied information. I suspect that sociotype.com derives a lot of its information from Wikisocion, but I'm not completely sure. And there's the Reddit Jungian typology, and that perspective, I notice, notably differs from almost all other perspectives on the board. So I have no idea how that happened, but they're there, and they definitely have their own perspective as well. So if you'll notice, I kind of went over just the English-speaking world just now, with this sort of iron curtain in the Cold War, blocking the Russians from the Americans and people in the UK. But yeah, for the most part, I've gone over pretty much how socionics spread, how it went from Aushra Augusta to the preliminary schools, how that split off, diverged, and how some of the schools transferred people over to the West. People brought ideas over and started this new influential English-speaking perspective that is still utilized today. And so the perspectives that I have circled in blue are the perspectives that make up Beats Havel, the perspectives that I teach, the perspectives that I align with, and the ones that are going to be synthesized and taught on this channel as they are. I obviously have a lot of influence from the Russian authors. I've read a lot of the Russian authors. But for the most part, my perspective is centralized in these four: Socionics.us, Whole Socionics, the World Socionics Society, and Wikisocion. So those four you can count on for their material to be released in this channel and archived in video form. So yeah, I've kind of gone over the various perspectives, and now I'm going to move to some more general principles about differing perspectives and varying perspectives in socionics as a whole. All right, here are some things to remember when we're talking about socionics as a whole, and when we're discussing the model, when we're talking about things that I would like my viewers to remember in case they run into some difficulties. One is that it's obvious from the board that socionics is not a hard science. Socionics grows and develops people's ideas, it develops and merges with other perspectives, and it's not centralized. So to treat it as a hard science would be sort of denying the essence of the field. In some sense it's a philosophy, in some sense it's an old psychological theory, in some sense it's a methodology, but what it is not is an empirical science. It's not something that can be studied within the context of modern psychology and centralized to one viewpoint. There is not one official socionic source. It's split up among all of these different authors and synthesized by whoever wishes to learn. So that is one thing to remember. Another thing to remember is that if you see somebody asserting something, making a heavy theoretical assumption, for example, this type does this, or this element means this, or for example, this function means this, or this quadrant does this. Whatever anybody says about the model, if you don't know their background, how do you know which perspective it comes from? You don't know which perspective it comes from. So always be wary when you're listening to other people's arguments. If somebody says something that you disagree with, and somebody makes a heavy theoretical assertion, it's not right to just disagree with them flat out. No, the elements don't do this. No, the functions don't do this, because they may have learned from any source that is completely different from the source that you study. And so it is best to discuss, figure out where the common ground is, and how the disagreement can be reconciled without claiming, no, this is wrong. Because as you'll remember, there is no official source to socionics, and anybody can come up with their own ideas and influence the field according to their liking. So that is another point to remember. And one last thing that I wanted to bring up to end this video off is that, sorry, my mind slipped a little bit there. One thing that I do want to end off this video with is the baseless criticism of other models. For example, sort of the inverse. If you see somebody else saying this perspective is not correct, for example, School of Humanitarian Socionics is not correct, it's stupid, or maybe School of System Socionics, maybe they're stupid, they don't know what they're talking about. That is something to be avoided as well, because we have no idea how these people got to their perspectives unless, of course, you've studied it or somebody else has studied it, and it makes no sense to criticize somebody else's perspective just on the basis that it does not agree with yours. So that's one last thing that I wanted to bring up. There are a lot of perspectives in socionics, there's a lot to explore, but that doesn't mean that there's a lot to criticize and a lot to put down. It just means that everybody's intellects are varied in this field, and then there's a lot of exploration taking place that leads to new discoveries, but can seem a little decentralized at times. So I apologize if this lecture was a little disorganized. I hope you managed to glean something from the history of socionics and how the perspectives changed and all of this wishy-washy crap on the board. So if you enjoyed the lecture, make sure to put a like on the video, and subscribe if you're new here to see more socionics content if you're interested, and I will see you all in the next video.